close to harvest as possible. So that was a bit of my experience with my family. I also had the good fortune of being raised in a great hunter-gatherer family. So we did a lot of elk hunting. We had venison, turkey, quail, doves, ducks, clams, canning tuna, all types of things. I mean, when I think back on it now, I realized that we were so lucky growing up with the huge gardens that my parents had, the abundance of the truck gardens in the Rogue Valley, the orchards here. I grew up on really good food and have really developed a love for farm to table type existence. Taking that a step further, then as a young adult, I took an opportunity to live on a small organic farm on 10 Mile Lake, which is on the Oregon coast. And I enjoyed kind of an off-grid lifestyle that was really close to the earth. And I did that for a number of years. Fast forward to marrying Richard and landing back here. I actually left for a little while and then I came back to the Rogue Valley in 2007 and I married Richard and we live on a little urban acreage here in East Medford. And I asked him one day, do you mind if I turn a little spot of the yard into garden? And he said, well, sure, but what do you really want? And I said, well, I want to turn this place into a huge farm. Is that okay? And he was so on board. So he participated in the land steward program and he's been on board. He's been my Hollywood farmer because he's from LA and he made his living as in his younger days in Hollywood. So I've often teased that he's my Hollywood farmer. But he comes with such great ideas. And if you enjoy what we talk about today and want to look at some of the other things further, take a look at the blog that I created on Jarel Sustainable Living. It's www.jarelsustainableliving.com. Facebook page, same name. And we'd be happy to create community because I think that's what this is all about. I think that I'm not unique. There are a lot of people in this area who have had great experiences like this. And I'm hoping that we can share some of those things together either tonight or in the future as we build community around sustainable living. And I think more now than ever that this is an art that needs to be passed on. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a little PowerPoint and we'll get started on that bit. And as you can see, I'm looking up because I have another screen and it's kind of above my head. So in 1980, I was really lucky to be hired as the baker at this inn, the Gustavus Inn. It's in Glacier Bay, Alaska. My boyfriend was hired as the gardener and we were so lucky because the Lesh family who owns it, this is currently owned by Joanne and Dave Lesh, but their parents, Jack and Sally, were the ones that owned it when I worked there. And Jack and Sally are so well known and beloved in that area for being such adventurous spirits. They actually gathered up their 8 kids into a school bus and moved from Boston to Alaska in 1960. And if you're really interested, you could look at a Life magazine article that chronicles their journey and some of the adventures. So it was, I landed into another eclectic experience right off the bat. Sally also taught me how to weave while I lived there, which was very cool. And as part of the experience of cooking at this inn, I also saw how they used the root cellar, which was the means that they used of holding their food over for the winter and for their guests at the inn. Now, it all started with a really good setup for gardening and growing. They had, of course, this is Alaska, so it does get snowy, and there was kind of permafrost type ground there. So they had the great garden shed and all of the tools, and they kept it all clean. And I really got a good firsthand look at what a really top-notch garden center looked like. Their gardening techniques and their practices allowed them to provide this fresh produce, abundant flowers in the summer, and great food on their tables, even in the wintertime. They grew the crops, of course, that were suitable for their zone and for the growing season. So a lot of root crops, berries, greens, different cool weather crops. But then, you know, it's 20 hours of sunlight up there during the summer. So they were able to maximize rhubarb and other things like that in their selection of vegetables that they grew. But that's all to say that because of these practices, they were able to offer a James Beard Award-winning menu. They have actually achieved some culinary accolades for what they provide from this inn. Now, again, it's located in Glacier Bay Park and right near Bartlett Cove. So if you ever want to take a peek and have a very interesting experience, fly up to Juneau and then hop over to Gustavus Inn, make some reservations and hang out, because it really is a lovely spot. Now, what was their secret? It was the root cellar. And again, I got to see that firsthand, which was very, very interesting. So you might ask, what is a root cellar? And here's the definition. It's in the basic terms that a root cellar is a space that maintains a stable, cooler temperature, ventilation, and high humidity used to store food. It can mean a lot of different things to different people, depending on a lot of different factors. For me, I grew up with my parents' experience, which was similar to this. This is a Pennsylvania house. My mom is from South Dakota, and my dad is from Pennsylvania. And when I would go to visit the grandparents in the old days, they had this kind of setup with what you can't see, a smoke house, or you know, the barns and some of the other buildings that a good Pennsylvania farm has. But I do remember very, very carefully walking down those narrow steps to that cool and damp and dark space in the basement. It had a certain smell about it that, you know, it's kind of burned into my brain. It just speaks to me of goodies in a place, some warm, fruity, sometimes not so great, depending on how well you sort the food, but you know, a great aroma that can occur within the area of good food preservation. In Pennsylvania, I remember that there was a spring that ran through the basement. And it was really, really cold water because it was basically groundwater. I can remember that Grandma Violet would place her Sunday Jell-O salad down there while we went to church. And by the time we returned from the service and she got the rest of the Sunday meal ready, it was set, and you know, we were just told to go down and retrieve it. I think that this space was one of the most interesting and maybe mystical places when I was a kid, because there were all these carefully crafted jars of food, different colors. I'm an artist too, and there's something about all those colorful foods in the jars, some of the holiday food that was preserved with food coloring for, maraschino cherries or green pears for a special salad or something. And there were just some fascinating types of jars of produce that were on the shelves, as well as the crocks of sauerkraut and crocks of pickles and churned butter and gathered eggs, smoked meats, jerky. Just so many lovely things that were stored down there. But that was my childhood, and you fast forward, I know my children did not get the benefit of a good old-timey household. And even though their great-grandparents had some of these experiences, by the time that they experienced them, we'd already had a bit of a culture shift. And that culture shift has kind of turned into this new basement concept. It's a new kind of use for this space. And so we don't necessarily have that cold, dark, damp area that I grew up with. Now, I've mentioned a few different types of preservations like canning or jerky or crocks, dried fruits or vegetables. And there's a lot of different preserving methods that you can use in your storage, in your root cellar, not just raw fruits and vegetables. But I wanted to take a moment to point you in the direction of the experts. Because if you're new to preserving food, I encourage you to reach out to some of these resources. You need to make sure you understand the science of food preservation so you can offer your family food that's safe to eat. Now, the master food preservers and the master gardeners at Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center have classes where you can become a master food preserver. And I really encourage you to look at that program. I'm sure that even with COVID, that we are learning how to do these Zoom classes and do the practicums in a new and invented way as we try to create our new normals. USDA guides are a good place to get information on the science of food preserving, research institution publications, books that have science-based evidence in them, articles. Now, I learned a lot from my parents and grandparents. I still enjoy a good internet search because you can find nearly anything you ever wanted to know. But experimenting and enjoying your food is really a fun thing. I just want to make sure that I point you into the direction of safe food handling, because that's a really important aspect when you're going to start into the art of preserving food. Of course, there's lots of books and websites and blogs and YouTube videos. There's an abundance of these things on the subjects. Again, I want to point you to the master food preservers so that I'll put in a shameless plug for that organization. Also, there's classes offered through Oregon State University, which is the home university for the Extension Center. And they have online classes as well, and quite a robust sustainable living permaculture master gardener programs that you can look at the university level. These books are some of the resources that I have used as reference guides, and I've prepared some handouts that Rachel mentioned, and she's going to share with you a little later so you can have some places to start. That bottom book called Putting Food By, that's one of my favorites, and it's really a Bible. It's gone through several different editions, trying to, again, keep up with the science of food preservation. And that Putting Food By is my favorite book and my go-to book whenever I may forget how to properly start the process in some sort of food or project. But now we're going to move into some of the specific information for some of the more popular types of vegetables and fruits that you may want to store. In my family, potatoes are one of the main starches that we like to hold over for the winter. They're a common crop to grow and store, and these pointers will help you to have success in your storage of these potatoes. I want to point out that sweet potatoes are just a little different plant, and that they require some special handling when you get them ready for wintering over. They need to get a hardened skin, and there's some tips and tricks to getting that skin hardened properly for storage. But they're substantially the same for overwintering once you get them to that place. Potatoes will last all winter. I've had them last a very, very long time if they're stored properly. Note the temperature, the 42 to 50 degree temperature that a potato likes or is optimum for storing that potato. Make a little mental note of temperatures as we go through this, and it will start creating for you the idea of zones, and about the fact that you may not have one area that you're going to create for storing food, but you might need to create several different areas depending on the conditions. So the temperature here of 42 to 50 degrees is notable. Also, pay attention to the amount of water that is in a potato, and that they need to be in a humid location that prevents them from drying out. I would imagine all of you have at one time or another found a shriveled potato in your bag or in a drawer that you may have forgotten about. So if you look at what commercial storage facilities do, they actually have a 90 to 95% relative humidity. And that relative humidity is a measurement that you are going to want to also pay attention to. And there are actual meters that you can purchase, like a temperature gauge, that will show you what the relative humidity is in your space along with the temperature. So pay attention to that a little bit: temperature, relative humidity, and notice what happens to potatoes in the light. Remember that we're talking about plants here. And so if any of you are master gardeners or you are gardeners in general, and you know the 4 factors of germination, it actually applies even to root cellaring, because we're trying to retard the growth of the plant. We're trying to slow it down. And plants are just amazing creatures. They want to grow, and they will travel from seed to seed, really, from the seed to leafing and setting fruit, and then flower, and then back to seed. And they'll do it rather rapidly depending on the conditions that you provide them to grow. When a plant gets stressed, they want to go to seed because they want to perpetuate their species, more or less. So if you look at them as little entities and you remember what those 4 factors of germination are, it'll go a long way to help you conceptualize what you're trying to slow down. So if you add light to a potato in storage, it will start sprouting eyes. And you can use those to grow new potatoes, but it doesn't make for a great holding over of that potato if you keep them stored or try to store them in too light of an area. Also note that last line: keep apples and potatoes away from each other in storage, because apples give off a gas that will make potatoes go foul. So you want to keep those 2 veggies kind of separated. Now here's kind of a rudimentary type of storage system. It's called the potato clamp. And you remember from the previous slide that potatoes like that relative humidity. It's a little higher humidity, but just remember that they don't like to be in standing water. So This type of storage system requires that the clamp be placed above kind of the ground watermark, and you need to spend some special care to make sure that this clamp is also easy to reach and sort, because sorting is another big factor in making sure that your food will last for an entire winter. Potatoes, but I don't know if you've ever had a rotten potato, if you've smelled the rotten potato, that you just know is going bad, because the whole corner of the house smells, and you know that something's really foul. And potatoes will do that. So you need to sort them. You need to make sure that that's part of the turnover process, even with this potato clamp type structure. I think that the best way to learn how to do this is with families. So I'm hopeful that you might be able to take some of these tips and tricks into your children or grandchildren, or share them with friends, because you know, many hands make light work in this type of activity. Now, carrots is another great food that we like to store. And I grew up with storing carrots in the ground. That's how my dad liked to do it. He never started harvesting these things until after the first frost, because the carrot tends to store sugar in the root after that first frost, so they become much more sweeter. It's that kiss of frost that can sometimes really liven up a turnip or a carrot, or I'm thinking of some of beets, for instance. That kiss of frost is real important. I'm going to point you to some of these tips on storing carrots, because remember we talked about how the plants in general are just they have so much ingenuity when it comes to growing. Sometimes you may find that you have sprouts on your carrots from the grocery store, that they've already started throwing extra leaves or roots. And so when you store your carrots, you're going to want to pay attention that you cut all of that green off, so that you don't get sprouting carrots, because the goodness inside that root will travel into the leaves to try to nourish them to grow. So what we're trying to do is, remember, we're trying to retard this process of going from seed to seed. And so cutting those green tops off is an important piece. Also, just as a sideline, something that we like doing around here is, when we do have sprouting vegetables in the drawer or in our larders, that we'll cut them and put them back into the garden. So for instance, you can take that green leafy growth from your stored carrot, and you can put it in the garden, and it will grow new greens. Now, it won't grow another root, another carrot, but it will grow more greens, and it will go to seed. So if you wanted to use the top as an opportunity to create more seed for saving seed, that would be something you can do. You can also use those carrot greens in your salads and soups and sauces, because that has that carrot flavor. So it's a unique way of being able to utilize what you have growing. We call it the kitchen trash garden. When we start throwing romaine lettuce, for instance, that starts to grow again, or the carrots or leeks or something, fennel will do that as well. So besides leaving the carrots in the ground, or you can put them into some storing medium. I think that one of the ways that I like doing it now, because I don't like necessarily to dig carrots in the middle of winter, is to put the carrots into moist sand. And that's a very interesting way of storing them. Remember that there's water in the carrots. And so again, we're trying to keep them plump. We don't want them to shrivel. You'll want to pay attention to the relative humidities and the temperatures that these guys like to be kept. And it looks like I didn't put that in there, but they are another one that likes that 32 to 42 degrees and a higher humidity because they will dry out and shrivel up. Also, if you do leave them in the ground, note that they will start getting mushy or woody in the spring. That tends to be the end all of the root, because the purpose of the carrot is to throw the seed. And so once that's done, then the root itself is kind of left to its own devices, and it will grow old and woody, and it's not as good. So in the spring, when that little spring of growth happens, that's a good time to pull all of your carrots out and juice them and start with that new crop. But like I said, I kind of like the sand method now because I'm not too keen on digging them in the middle of the winter. Another staple in our yard or our lives is the onions and the garlic. I really cook with that a lot. And there are a lot of creative ways that you can store those little goodies. If you are a successful onion and garlic grower, you'll find some of these tips helpful in storing them over winter. If you're lucky to have kept some of your mesh bags from store purchases, they make great bags for hanging in your storage space. But note the reminder of the cool, dark, and in this case, the less humid location. Now, note that you don't wash your onions before storing them. And you probably can't store all of your onions. That depends, of course, on how successful you were in growing them, but if you have a big bumper crop, then you're going to really want to sort them. Look at that temperature here, 32 to 40 degrees. And in this case, closer to 32, the better. That helps to keep them from going mushy or soft. But look at the relative humidity. They don't really like it too damp, so you're going to want to have a drier place, a drier zone for these onions, and you're going to want to make sure that you have good circulation. Now, I don't particularly store these onions and garlic in a root cellar. I actually store them sometimes in a back bedroom that I'm not using, that I keep closed up and that doesn't have a heat source to it. So it stays really cool, but you'll have to play with your areas to see what works for you. And if you do decide that you want to try braiding, there's a little tip here about using cord to braid in with your green stems so that you don't have that brittle top that breaks off when you're trying to braid it. So braiding them green is what you need to do in order to get them to set or dry with that nice braid so that you can hang them. Now, I mentioned Pennsylvania in my upbringing from my dad's side, and yes, I am Pennsylvania Dutch by birth, and we eat a lot of sauerkraut, and I grew up on sauerkraut as a main staple. We had crocks of pickles and some cabbage that we held over on shelves, but primarily we made crocks of sauerkraut. And one of the tips that I like to do is to store my sauerkraut with a heavy lid that keeps the shredded cabbage in the brine, like below the water level of the brine. And so if you put a plate on top of it or some sort of glass or heavy source to weight that cabbage down, and then you fill a garbage bag full of water and you set it on top of it, it seals that crock area from oxygen, which retards the molding and bacterial growth. So you'll have that cabbage below the brine brining, and then throughout the winter you can pull that garbage bag off, clean up the plate, use some of the sauerkraut for a meal or a condiment. You know, sauerkraut nowadays is looked at like kimchi or another type of pickle condiment, and it adds that salty, acidic flavor and a little crunch if you use it fresh from the crock, because it's not cooked to the consistency that you would find in grocery store type sauerkraut. So crocked sauerkraut tends to, even though it's brined, it still has a bit of that tooth to it. So it's a satisfying crunch like a pickle or something. So using the crock method for storing butter or eggs or pickles allows you to dip into it without actually put something into a sealed jar. And it's just another method of preservation. Now, I grew up on some of these homemade sauerkrauts and pickles, and there's other little things you can do with your cabbage plants that help to keep them producing for you. So the tip in this slide is to not pull up the plant. If you're going to harvest, if you can cut it, then there are many vegetables like the cabbage that will sprout edible shoots or greens as a second source of food. So over the winter, if you cut your cabbage correctly, you could actually get these little mini, almost like Brussels sprouts, that grow up on your cabbage plant that you can then have as another crop while your large head of cabbage is either stored or in sauerkraut form. Note that late fall or winter cabbage is what we're talking about. Cabbage that you may have in head form right now, depending on how large the head is, may not be suitable for actually wintering over. So looking at the timing of when your cabbage plant is ready to actually be harvested will determine just how much you can actually hold it over. Now, my husband grew up on this vegetable, and I'm afraid his mom wasn't the greatest cook, so getting him to eat beets is pretty tough actually. But my experience as a kid was better, and I like to grate beets in salads. I like to pickle them or puree them for a wide range of recipes like a red velvet cake or maybe a borscht or some other sauce. Beets can be very versatile, and so and we can grow them pretty well around here. There are a few different ways to store beets, as the slide says, but they're kind of similar to carrots in the method that works well for them. Note again, the temperature. Note the relative humidity. And again, remember that these beets have a moisture in them. Something that's kind of interesting about beets is that if you remove the root end, you're going to cause it to bleed, and that'll bleed moisture out. Also, if you leave the leaves on them, then the water goes into the leaves to try to nourish them, and it pulls it out of the roots. So again, this is one of those plants that you want to make sure you've got the leaves off, but don't clip the ends since you don't want it to bleed out. Now, layering them in damp sand is also a really good way, just like with carrots. Carrots might throw a few hairs while they're laying in the damp sand, but they don't necessarily root. So it is something that I've seen them do, but it doesn't seem to harm the quality of the carrot or the beet when they are stored in damp sand. But note that even though you might want to keep your beets in that temperature of 32 to 40, which your onions like that temperature. So let's say that you want to keep your beets in with the in the same room or the same zone as your onions. Remember that your onions like it dry, but your beets need a relative humidity that is higher. So this little tip of putting them into a plastic container and then putting the tight lid on them allows you to keep the moist sand moist and to yet keep it into the cool area. So those are some little tips to think about when you are considering where you're going to store things and starting to create those zones again. Now, we're in Oregon, right? And what fruit is second nature to most of us who live in Oregon? And we're just south of Washington. Yeah, it's the apples. And, you know, I have to laugh because I kind of take apples for granted. Because I have known how to hold them over, I don't know a time of the year where I don't have apples available. And I'm kind of spoiled in that way. Now, my dad, who is 90 years old, to this day, he collects several boxes of apples from his trees and he places them in a refrigerator in his garage that he has specifically there for overwintering and storage. Now, one of the true keys to keeping apples healthy over the winter is to sort them. Because as you all know, it only takes one bad apple to ruin the whole bunch. And that is absolutely true in storing them in a root cellar. So if you keep them, look at that temperature between 32 and 45. And let's talk about relative humidity. Again, it's a fruit that has a high water content. So you're going to want to keep them somewhat damp. So you increase that humidity, but you don't want them sitting in water. And then you have to sort, because when you are storing apples, it's very easy, especially with fruit like apples, peaches, and pears. The bruising will start a rotten spot. And if it touches another apple, then you're going to end up with, you know, an entire section in your box of apples that is going bad. And just a reminder again that apples and potatoes need to be stored away from each other because of that gas that they put off. And something else to bear in mind when you're storing apples is to consider the variety. Now, I love yellow delicious apples, and they store a lot better than red delicious apples. But red delicious apples just don't store very well. Gravenstein store pretty good, but Granny Smith's will really store well because they've got a thicker skin and they're a bit tartar. So that's another consideration when you're considering an apple that you may want to store. Now, one of the first things that you may want to consider when you have grown a large garden, you know, it's very satisfying to have a plan for that abundance. So I'm really glad that you're all here, because this is the time of year when you should start thinking about where you are going to put some of that food that you want to keep for over the winter, or you might want to experiment with this winter. You might think about what you want to have in your larder. I suspect that many of you are here because you want to explore that starting place in your root cellar journey. And I think that there are so many interesting ideas out there that you could use to create your space, your zone. I think that eating locally and affordably throughout the winter is possible. And I think it is a matter of creativity. Like I said, one of the first considerations is choosing what to store. And there are some things to think about. when you're growing and storing onions, for instance, this sweet onion, Walla Walla and Vidalias, they are so yummy, but quite honestly, they don't store really well. They don't store as well as hard yellow onions. So you may want to eat any of those Vidalias or Walla Wallas first, but store your hard yellows. And that would be something that you would research on the seed, the back of the seed package, or maybe on your seed catalogs. I know Territorial Seed has is my favorite, and I love reading that catalog and finding about the different varieties and about the characteristics and the days to harvest and all of the pertinent information that helps you to understand what the type of variety within that vegetable group or fruit group that you are considering storing. So as you can see, studying the what of what you want to store actually starts a lot sooner than August. If you're going to really become a great root cellar aficionado. The next consideration is, when are you going to harvest your plants to be able to get a successful experience in this root cellaring? And one of the things that folks may not think about is that planting for root cellaring is a thing. It's not just a knee-jerk reaction at the end of the growing season when you have a bunch of stuff left over. So if you really do want to get serious about this, you're going to want to plant and use timing of your planting to be able to harvest the vegetables and fruits that you want to hold over. And you may have several different plantings, so some that you can eat during the growing season, and then some that you're going to harvest just for the purpose of root cellaring. Remember that little tip at the bottom, carrots planted in June are really able to be stored in the root cellar in November because they will have transitioned to that woody state by then, and they just won't be suitable for that purpose. So the when is extremely important so you can collect the best in your garden. If you're harvesting produce that's past its prime, you're better served to find other ways of preserving it, like making jam or sauce, or to can it in a jar, or to freeze it, because crops that are used for root cellaring should be the prime vegetable or fruit that you're picking. You're picking for the conditions so that it can weather that natural tendency for plants to want to go from seed to seed, remember? And we're talking about that 4 factors of germination. So, we're trying to retard that. So we're trying to pick it in its prime. We don't want it to be bruised. We don't want it to be, on the downside of that arc that we're trying to control in the root cellar process. So one of the other important characteristics that I've been trying to point out to you is, for instance, the temperature that you maintain in your space. And we've already started the conversation about the zones that you are going to need in your root cellar or your home or wherever the space is that you're going to use to put your food by. So the temperature is something that you'll need to control, and you'll need a device to kind of see what those zones are. So I encourage you to kind of think about that as you plan for your zone area in this upcoming season. Remember that humidity is an important factor for some of your water-laden vegetables and fruits. And it's a little trickier to maintain as temperature and an available water source affects the zone. So if, for instance, you have the water vapor content, it stays the same, and then the temperature drops, the relative humidity increases. But if you have the water vapor content stays the same and the temperature rises, the relative humidity decreases. So this is because the colder air doesn't require as much moisture to become saturated as warmer air. And that will be a consideration in your little zone. Even if you've got the temperature figured out, you're going to want to also consider that humidity. Now, we also have light as a consideration here. And the purpose of the root cellar, again, is to slow down the life cycle of the plant. So remember, I think I mentioned earlier, the 4 factors of germination that affect the seed. The root cellar, again, is trying to control them so the plants don't continue to grow. So I don't know if I even mentioned what the 4 factors of germination are. Maybe you already know it. And if you do, say it to yourself. It's light and temperature and oxygen and moisture. And so you can see how that is, how that plays into what we've already talked about in terms of the temperature and the relative humidities. And now the light, they should be kept dark because they will be drawn to grow when you add that other factor into their life cycle. So we've talked about zones and we've talked about temperatures and relative humidity, but now we have containers. So we have a lot of variety of containers, but it's really going to be dependent on your space as to what you use. So in this slide, I'm talking a bit about some of the different types of containers and maybe even some of the types of packaging that you may want to put around the vegetable to either as a moisture barrier or to increase the moisture depending on what you're trying to create here. But again, this depends on your space and the amount of room that you may have to even start in this endeavor. You can see that it could be anything from a tabletop to a back room to a root cellar. There are a lot of different ideas that you can come up with to make this happen. And there are some packaging materials that work better than others that you can use in addition to your container. You just want to make sure that you've got clean sand and clean leaves and clean straw and clean wrapping paper because you know, the whole idea is that you're trying to maintain a bit of sanitary action, even though there are some steps to good storage that are a bit dirty as well. We've covered some of these tips already, but you'll notice only the best as number 1. Remember, we talked about doing something else with your broken and bruised vegetables and fruits, canning, freezing, some other type of preservation method, but your best stuff is what you're going to want to hold over. And keep it dirty. That's something that's really important too. Some of the produce just does not do well when you wash it, and you'll want to be very gentle when you are getting rid of the soil. You don't want it caked on, but you also don't want to bruise or nick the flesh as you're trying to prepare it to store, because that hardened outside skin is what's going to be a bit of a barrier to help you winter over that particular vegetable or fruit. Remember how we removed the leaves of roots such as beets and carrots, but you don't necessarily clip the bottom of the beet or the bottom of the carrot for that matter. You just remove the leaves to retard that growing. And then sorting, because little fruits and vegetables will go bad faster than large ones. So you'll want to sort by size, and you'll want to use it with the little stuff first, and then graduate down to your larger. So if you're going to layer in sand, for instance, you'll want to layer your bigger stuff at the bottom, and then sift through it with your smaller things up front. And then I mentioned that frost is your friend sometimes, and that has to do with that little nip of frost for some of those vegetables that will draw sugar into the roots, and then they're really tasty, much better. And then for onions, this little tip of shocking it first, it helps the plant to prepare to be hardened. The paper on the outside of the onion starts developing, and then you'll get that protective barrier for your onions when you're about ready to put them into storage. Now, pests and disease, that's a tough one. And, you know, we all deal with it in different manners, depending again on the space. One tip with nuts, for instance, is to store them in the freezer. That's a really good way to maintain their freshness. They won't go rancid as fast. And it also helps to keep the bugs and pests away from them. And for grains, you can store them in like a Mylar storage bag with a packet of silica gel. That helps to remove the oxygen from there. It also seals them up so that you don't have the bugs. Something that I like to do with my grains is I stick them in the freezer for about 3 hours, and that helps to kind of kill some bugs or anything that might be in them that I can't see. And then I put them into the Mylar bag with the silica gel or a vacuum sealed bag to remove the oxygen. But I think that the rodents are one of the single most common pest problems. And here's a few tips for how to handle them. You know, we all have our bane of our existence. Again, storing anything requires that you sort it, because sorting is going to keep your food fresher as you're trying to winter it over. I mentioned the nuts and grains. That's why I like to put them in the freezer or in those airtight containers. Now, damage control is important, and it's about checking it often. One of the pitfalls, I think, about storing anything is that it's kind of out of sight or out of mind. I mean, if you think about what it's like when you put something on your kitchen counter, a butternut squash maybe that you have sitting in your kitchen counter, and you can kind of get an idea of how long it takes to start rotting before you actually have to remove it off that counter. Well, if you can control the space that you've put that in with the temperature, the relative humidity, the light factor, the type of storing container and packaging material you have on it, you might be able to extend that just a bit longer. And so, but you have to sort, you have to check it often, and you have to keep it as sanitary as possible. It's really easy to kind of forget about your root cellar. Right? So it is an investment in time, because you are going to have to check it. There's a lot of different storage ideas, and I think there are some awfully creative ones out there. And again, it depends on the space that you have available and what you can commandeer in your home that will be unique to you. Whether you have a nook and cranny that is, you know, different ones for different zones, it's something just to bear in mind. You may not want to stash all of your food in the same location. So remember that zones are important for different produce, and you may be using several different locations. Now, whether you are a commercial storage place where you might have, you know, really large bins full of things, or whether you are just doing a back entry, there's so many different options, whether you're inside and outside. There's just so many ideas. But now that you've got an idea of the guidelines for some of these fruits and vegetables, and you've learned why we do the little why we follow these guidelines, then you should be able to look around and adapt the storage area that you have available for that, to make that optimal storage space for whatever you're going to try to harvest. Remember that any outside storage in our area has to take into consideration that groundwater level. So if you do try any of these in the ground type ideas, you just want to make sure that you're monitoring that groundwater level, because we get a good hard rain. That cooler in the picture could easily fill up with water, and fruits and vegetables, while they may like high humidity, they are not necessarily happy in standing water. I also think that this is such a unique idea. I haven't tried this one, but I thought it was an innovative way to use an old appliance and to keep it relevant, you know, to be able to use the insulation factors and maybe add a few vent holes there and some other ideas to actually use this to store food. There are also many different plans available on the internet and through the USDA, through extensions and universities all around the world. So you can find a lot of different plans that if you wanted to actually start building something. This plan could be sophisticated or it can just be rudimentary, but there are lots of different ways to create a space. Now, if you're going to set up this simple root cellar, you want to remember again that the purpose of the root cellar is to retard the growing cycle of the plant. So you want to set up those optimum environments and control those 4 factors of germination: the light, the temperature, the moisture, and the oxygen. And in the case of the root cellar, controlling the oxygen is more about circulation sometimes, and then removal other times. So it depends on whether you're trying to vacuum seal it or whether you're trying to circulate so that you don't encourage a mold growth, especially with a high relative humidity. This Quonset hut idea, buried in the ground, was the method that the Gustavus Inn used, and it was a remarkably good system with steps. It was buried into the ground a little bit, and the steps that went down into it with a gravel floor and shelves and sod over the top of it. And it was really a unique and quite attractive way of creating a little root cellar. And I encourage you to ask for help, you know, what I talked about earlier in creating this community, a community environment where we share our ideas and we talk about them. And if there are crafty people, sometimes with all of the interests in this area in agriculture, finding someone with some sort of experience in creating anything from aquaponics to greenhouses to root cellars is really just a Craigslist ad. So I have found some fabulous helpers on Craigslist who have come with beautiful experience in a lot of different realms and have just been, you know, really enriching in my life as they've shared their experiences and we work together to make this whole thing work. I think that there are a lot of eclectic ideas, and there's so many designs to choose from old-time construction to even something that is an individually created idea. There's a combination of the artistic and the functional that it really appeals to my artistic eye. And I think that it can be an awful lot of fun in trying to incorporate the color of fruits and vegetables in the garden, and then also the eclectic buildings maybe that you have around your space to create that environment and creating that space, which is part of the journey of root cellaring. Now, having a good source of nutritious food, lovingly prepared and processed, is so rewarding. And like I said in the beginning of the presentation, I look back now on the legacy of good food that I grew up on and the handing down of all of these tips and techniques that are, for me, secondhand because I grew up doing them. It's made me a very happy camper, and I really do find joy and solace in creating a good jalapeno chunky jam out of my great jalapeno plants right now. It's one of my favorite things at the moment. And figuring out, I'm kind of in a condiment place right now where I'm trying to determine how to make some really tasty additions to food that I can create. I've just picked some plums that were hanging over into my yard from my neighbor's tree, and he's very open to sharing the fruit with me. So I've picked the plums, and since I already had about 18 jars of plums in my larder already, I decided to make puree out of them, and I am going to experiment with making some fruit leathers from that plums here this week, in fact. But now is the time. It's the time to start scouting for your storage spots, and it's time for you to start thinking about your zones and start considering the what, the when, the why, the timing, and all of that good stuff. I once had a fruit and vegetable stand during some of my alternative years. It was in Winchester Bay on the Oregon coast, and I remember picking from the farms along the Umpqua River drainage in the morning, selling at the fruit stand all day. And then I came back to my little camper in Lakeside, Oregon, and I made jams and I canned produce over an open fire because I was sorting my produce from my fruit stand and I didn't want anything to go bad. So I remember putting like 300 jars of food through that open fire water bath that summer. Whether you work as a team or you decide to do this independently, large endeavor or small endeavor, I hope that you found this information helpful and that these basic tips are something that can enhance your lifelong practice as a gardener and maybe provide for your families. I think that it's one of those lost arts, and I hope that you found this somewhat entertaining and also that you found some benefit. But now I think we have some questions, maybe, Rachel? I'll stop.
Yeah, would you like me to read through the chat and kind of read?
Hang on, I'm gonna stop sharing here. All right.
I lost the chat. Will it be helpful if I read them for you, or do you want to read through them? Yeah, okay, because I've been reading them a lot. You're not hearing me?
I can hear you.
Okay, let's see here. So here we go. So folks found the web address. Okay, so I was unclear on the definition of sorting during the potato clamp slide. Does this mean placing the biggest ones on the bottom? And there was another question about that, like how often would you sort them? So maybe you could clarify a little bit more about sorting or checking them for rot, kind of those.
Sure. I think it's important to set up some sort of schedule. For instance, maybe once a week is a good time to set aside an hour to sort through that potato clamp. Think again about what it's like when you have a bag of potatoes wherever you keep them now and how frequently they will go bad. Watch them now as you are looking at your store-bought produce, and it will give you a much better idea of what you're going to experience when you're actually trying to winter over. But remember, when we're talking about the tips and the tricks, that we're learning how to keep them at an optimal level of temperature and relative humidity and packaging material and light and darkness, so that we do our best to retard that growing process. So if you are keeping your potatoes in a clamp, for instance, out of the water, but you've got them in that cool environment and they are somewhat damp but not drenched, you may really be able to hold them over a lot longer. And sorting them is just your way of staying on top of it. So yeah, putting the biggest potatoes at the bottom of the clamp and then the littlest ones at the top, use them first, and then just get yourself resigned to the fact that you're going to have to sort your food to keep that rot from taking over. I hope that answered it. Please tell me if it didn't.
Okay, I think that covered kind of the different ways that question was being answered. We'll see if we get to the end. Then there were some questions about the greens, cutting the greens off of the carrots, and I wasn't sure if that meant just the leaves, or did that also mean the way the, I don't think it means the way the top of a carrot can be a little green if it's growing out of the soil a little.
Right, it's kind of that nubbin that's out there. You want to remove all greenery. I guess that's a better way.
The leaves.
Yeah, the leaves.
Okay.
You don't necessarily want to cut, excuse me, you don't want to cut the top because you don't want that moisture to bleed out, like in the tip of the beet, for instance. You don't want to cut into that outer skin, but you do want to remove the leaves and keep your eyes open for the leaves to form, because depending on how good you are at retarding that growth process, then your carrots will last a lot longer.
Okay. Okay. And then, okay, so the photo of the onions, there were apples in the same location, apples and onions okay together. You mentioned that apples and potatoes shouldn't be together.
That's right. But then again, remember that apples take a higher relative humidity than onions. So my guess on that particular slide is that the relative humidity was either low enough for the onions to stay good, but not high enough for the apples. So you may end up with some wrinkly apples next to those stored onions. So remember, it's about zones,
Right.
and you have to balance that relative humidity and that temperature.
Okay, we have some more questions about that later on. Okay. Then about the carrots, back to the carrots, how often do you need to, or do you need to re-moisten the sand that you're using for the carrots or the beets?
Yeah, that's kind of something you'll learn as you move through the process of using that, because I don't think there's any time frame that I can give you. Again, it depends on the place you've stored them. Do you have them in a really dry location? Then you don't have a tight lid on them. So you again may have your carrots in with your onions, which are all in the same low temperature, one dry, one needing more moisture. And so you may have to develop in your space for your onions the plastic tub, and I think like a dog food container, for instance, is about the right size to store enough carrots in that you can sort through it, you can keep track of it, but it's not such a gigantic container that it's a real ordeal to have to go sorting through. So I like to try to keep things manageable, and that's something to think about when you are storing. If, for instance, you stored in that gigantic freezer all of your potatoes, can you imagine what the sorting is like for that?
I was thinking of that with even your image of the potato clamp. I thought, boy, once a week going through all those potatoes.
Exactly. So consider the size, consider.
Right. I liked the pictures where there were several grocery bags, and I'm not sure what was in those bags, but I thought each bag then is kind of a separate unit.
Exactly.
Okay, let's see. And then also any kind of sand, what type of sand should you use and where can you get it?
Well, you can buy sand at Lowe's, for instance, in bags. I would say clean sand, sand that's not mixed for concrete, for instance. You don't want that. You don't want a mixture. You just want clean sand. I'm not sure that I would use sand that was in, for instance, a landscape supply area, because you never know if that's ending up being the cat box for the neighborhood.
Mm.
So you want to maintain that cleanliness. If you are going to use a bag of sand for storage, personally, I buy the sand in a bag so that I know that it hasn't been used as a dumping ground by some rodent or other animal.
Right. Okay, and then there was a question about actually constructing them. What's your favorite resource for constructing for plants? And you mentioned the internet, but I had this book, which is on your list, the root cellaring book, and I know there are a bunch of different plans in there. Do you have another specific resource that you like?
I don't, because there are just so many different styles. Now, you know, I'm married to an artist, and he comes up with some really innovative things. And again, we like the art part of it. So, you know, a stuccoed building or some sort of unique doorway or something into a little shed. Those are all little characteristics that I personally love. So no, I don't have any specifics, but I really encourage everybody to have fun looking at all the available ones, because there are tons out there.
Okay. And then there were a couple of questions. This says, with high humidity, is there any worry about mold or fungus growth? And someone else said, if you have that high humidity, say in your basement, do you have to worry about that kind of contaminating your home with fungal growth?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, you do. That's why part of the process is that oxygen circulation. We talked about ventilation, and you'll notice that on many of the plans that you find, there might be fans incorporated into a building plan, or some way where moisture or air can circulate so that you can ward that off. But then again, you're keeping relative humidity high. So I've been in some places where you have to have a dehumidifier over the winter because it's so damp. And that's just to keep black mold from growing. So yeah, it's a real balance, and that circulation of air is real important.
Okay.
Oh, and I want to add to that when you do have relative humidity, sometimes it's helpful to either have a moisture barrier or to be able to contain moisture. So when you're looking at your packaging material, like the sand that you want to keep moist, that keeps that relative humidity in the container. It doesn't necessarily bring it out into your space. Also, if you wrap apples in newsprint or newspaper and put them in a box, that helps to enclose them so that the apple next to them doesn't make them rot. And also it helps to maintain that moisture barrier. So you can use some of those tips and tricks, sawdust, leaves, that kind of thing, to help to regulate some of that moisture content as you create the circulation and figure out your zone.
Okay. Let's see. Do you know, I had a landowner asking me if a root cellar, kind of a classically, you know, like in the side of a hillside with a doorway, would that be cool enough for, I noticed a lot of the temperatures were between 32 and 42. Would it be cool enough in our climate here for that?
It does depend on, I've forgotten what the ratio is just off the top of my head, but there is a ratio of feet of soil on top of a structure as to the amount of temperature that it can keep. And I know that 50-ish degrees is something that buildings will gravitate towards as a constant if you get into the ground. So yeah, Google the insulation factor of soil when you are looking at putting something into the ground, because that factor will determine the main temperature that you can keep something at. And again, remember that even if you built something into the side of the hill and it was at 50 degrees, you'd still have to look at the relative humidity and the air circulation as part of that zone that you're creating. So maybe that structure wouldn't be suitable for everything you want to keep, but it will be really good for things, especially if you're using it to store your canned food, your crocks, that kind of thing in a constant temperature environment like that is really good.
Right. So this is kind of a related question to what you were saying. If you only have a small root cellar, how do you make different zones of temperature and humidity?
Well, yeah, good question. And it's going to be an experiment on your parts.
You kind of have to have different places.
Yeah,
Like,
and you use your
yeah.
containers. But now
Mhm.
that you've got the factors, now that you know what the that 4 factors of germination are that you're trying to control, now that you understand that, you can apply that to the spaces that you have. So you're armed now with some guidelines that you can kind of step back and look at the spaces that you have. And as you evaluate them, hopefully with the handouts that you will get, you'll be able to refer back and you'll be able to go, oh yeah, this will be a good spot for this, but it may not be the right spot for this. So these guidelines are so that you have knowledge and power in creating your space.
Good. Okay, here's a question. We have somebody here from Nevada. I live in the high desert of Nevada and humidity is always an issue. Do you have any tips for keeping the humidity up? So just the opposite question. We're planning to build a cellar into a sand hill on our homestead. Is a concrete floor okay, or is gravel better?
Well, let's see. We're talking about a dry area. So you're trying to keep more moisture. I would think maybe the concrete floor would be helpful for that, just because it might sweat a little and allow you to have a bit more humidity. A bucket of water in your space would allow for humidity to be created. So that's an easy one, a bucket of water in your space.
That's a good idea. Okay, I'm planning to grow persimmons and quince. Would these be stored similar to apples?
Those would be stored similar to plums, for instance. And so those fruits, I would think that wrapping them in newspaper would be a good idea. But they're also not a fruit that winters over really well. I mean, to some extent it does, and as long as you keep them from being soaking wet so that the skin doesn't start to rot, sometimes you're amazed at how long you can keep those things. But um, I believe, and again, I recommend that you get that book, Putting Food By, because it will have a notation about plums. And I'm sorry, I don't know right off the top of my head what the conditions are for them. But no, I don't believe that they would be the same as apples. I think they're a bit more fragile. So you'll want to read up on that.
Right. Okay. And then back to the carrots in the sand. If there's no specific time frame for remoistening moist sand, is there a certain dampness by feel on the sand when you know it's time to water again? And would you just pour water on it or some other method?
Well, personally, I just pour water on it. And it's just so that when, well, have you ever built a sand castle and you know where that sand is packed enough to hold a shape? That's the moisture right there.
Okay, great. So somebody made the comment, I think they have a type of sand called playground sand or something like that. So that was just for the sand.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Wouldn't circulation and oxygen and help speed up the growth cycle on your stored plants? Wouldn't circulation? So if you have circulation in there,
Right.
that
Well,
speeds. Yeah.
if you are doing a good job of retarding the 3 factors of germination, then keeping that oxygen circulating will just help to ward off that mildew or rot, which will be a real deterrent. So you'll have to play with the space to see just how much ventilation you need or don't need. But circulation is really important.
Yeah. Let's see, and then here's another question about why would persimmons or quince be stored like plums, even though it's palm versus stone fruit? Although I think persimmons are actually related to, they're not related to apples, but they're just more delicate, I think is what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm saying. Although I've had persimmons last for a very long time. They might get kind of dried out and a little dense, but oh, I love persimmons. It's one of my favorite fruits.
Yeah, there are the two kinds, and the one that gets really soft, I've had that one dried and seen how they dry it, hanging them by the stems and massaging them. So maybe that's a better way to store at least those persimmons.
That'd be kind of fun to try. Maybe storing them on a screen or something so that you can take advantage of that drying process if you want to. Maybe you can have persimmon raisins then.
Oh, and then Marcy, who I know has a lot of persimmons, she says, Hachia persimmons are not likely to store well. I think that's the softening one. But food persimmons have a much longer shelf life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
that again goes hand in hand with what I talked about in terms of reading the seed catalogs and looking at the different varieties of fruits and vegetables that you want to store. Look at the characteristics, because that's going to really dictate what you can or cannot successfully winter over.
Good. Okay, and then Marcy again says that they have had great success in dehydrating their hachia.
Oh, nice.
So actually in a dehydrator. So
Yeah.
all the questions in the chat, and folks were saying thank you so much for the class, and
Welcome. Thank you guys.
thank you for joining us. And I will get the references, which you guys haven't seen yet. It will include a PDF from Tresa, and there will be a link to a recording for this, and it takes a little while for that to be generated, but I will share that. And we'll also have a brief survey and ideas for other classes if you want to share with us. So please do that when you get your emails. So thank you for joining us. That was really informative. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. Yes, lots of thanks coming in there on the chats.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting and we'll all be back to our homes.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Actually, I'm only having leave the meeting as an option.
Do you want me to see how we might be able to just end it for everyone?
Yeah, see if you can end it. It's just saying I can.
Is it okay if I do it and it ends it abruptly?
Yeah, we're okay.
Let's see if that works. End meeting for all.